Every minute of Narrative's reporting, every story that we break is made possible by our patrons. You too can become a patron by joining at patreon.com/narrative.
Narrative, where truth lives.
From Beijing to New York, Jerusalem to Washington, and from Doha to Riyadh, the world is echoing a single message: a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is back in the region this evening, unveiling a 5-point plan to ensure Palestinian statehood after the war is over. That's tonight on Narrative. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Narrative. Amid the graphic war reporting and the mounting death toll, a momentous shift towards peace is happening in the Middle East. Israel and Palestine seem to be on the road to a two-state solution, with a lot of encouragement from President Joe Biden's administration. 6 more Israeli hostages have just been freed from Gaza, the latest group in ongoing ceasefire talks. In total, Israel has secured the release of 120 citizens from Hamas captivity. Yet, over 75 Israelis and 4 Thai nationals still remain held in Gaza following the October 7 attacks. As negotiations continue, we're learning distressing details of what hostages endured, injuries, and branding among them. The staged release of hostages comes as U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken warns Israel it cannot do in the south of Gaza what it did in the north. Blinken is encouraging both sides to prevent further violence, although he says that Israel cannot resume its ground invasion unless safe zones are established. I'm joined tonight by Rick Petree, an international investment banker and Council of Foreign Relations member. He's got tremendous expertise in the region and will discuss the latest on the hostage releases, ceasefire talks, and prospects for peace between Israel and Palestine. We've now had 8 additional hostages in the process of being handed over to Israel in what was another successful day in the prisoner swap. What's your take on how things have gone since the hostage exchange deal was announced last week until now?
I'm relieved, and I share in the joy of all of the families who are now receiving their loved ones back. And I just hope that as many, if not all, of the people who have been taken and who remain in Gaza will get out. And the sort of uber optimistic hope would be that the break in the rhythm of the Israeli campaign in the northern Gaza that has been achieved through this ceasefire and the hostage release can somehow be maintained, and that in that quiet period, some fruitful talks can at least begin as to what the way forward is here in the region.
Yeah, of course, we are hearing that 2 of the hostages will not be coming home. They're now believed dead, although we're not quite sure that they died on the way there or how those deaths happened, but they've added to the death toll. And we're also hearing very horrific accounts of the hostage, the way they were treated inside those tunnels. There was one incident where one of the hostages had an injury to her arm and she was treated by a vet. That was who they had to look after her. She's very pale and weak after all of that, and I'm sure it must have been horrifying for her. She's deeply traumatized. So we're hearing those kinds of things. There's also the branding of some of the hostages. You buy motorcycle exhaust parts that they use to brand the hostages so they would be able to identify them on the way. The kind of inhumane things you expect from Hamas, we're seeing from Hamas, which certainly worries everyone who thinks about the remaining American. There's a lot of American hostages that are still being held and other foreigners.
Personally, in terms of my own intake of those kinds of stories about mistreatment, I'm cautious about coming to a firm view as to what may or may not have happened, simply because I'm well aware, as I'm sure you are and everyone else is, that there's a great potential here for disinformation on both sides. So I think eventually the true state of affairs or the true facts will emerge, and we'll all be able to form our views at that point. But we see kumbaya kind of videos of handshaking and embracing between captors and captives as they climb into their Red Cross vans to be taken out. Those kinds of things also I don't credit or give any great weight to at this point. There may be later some stories told by some of the hostages that they were well treated. And then people will start to talk about Stockholm syndrome and all that kind of thing. We're just still very close to it all, and I think it's too early to form any real view as to what the care and treatment of these captives has been.
Indeed, that's a very good point of caution there. And also, it's worth noting that the handover has been going well on both sides. But we look at as we just looked at, are from the Israelis returning to their side, and also there's Palestinian prisoners that are being returned to Gaza and to Ramallah. And they seem to be they're being welcomed as well by their families. We have to remember there's families on both sides. And on each side, there's obvious joy at the return of their family members. And it's something very maybe necessary in the Israeli Middle East peace process that this sort of happens, that we see this day by day sort of exchange of prisoners. Maybe that's just one of the necessary steps on the way to peace.
Yeah. One side story to the release of Israeli prisoners, that is prisoners of Israel, held by Israel, is that I saw a very interesting article, I think it was by Dan Seidman, who writes in the Jerusalem Post today, about the scale of the Israeli incursion that has happened over the last 24, 48 hours in Jenin, and the arrest there of a number of Palestinians, which virtually equates to or cancels out the numbers who have been released through the hostage exchange program. Israeli jails are still full, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And the violence continues. There was another attack in Jerusalem today by terrorists. This is a very volatile situation, of course. But I'm going to add a little bit of optimism to this conversation, because I thought Blinken arrived this evening to Tel Aviv and it was quite forceful, it appears, with the prime minister telling Bibi Netanyahu that they can't go into the southern part of Gaza, where a lot of the people who evacuated from the northern part, there's 2 million people in the southern part. And he basically has told Bibi Netanyahu that they cannot be as thorough, as I don't know if that's the right word, as murderous as they have been in the north. I think they've had 15,000 casualties so far, which is that can't be repeated in the south. Obviously, it can't continue. The entire world is condemning that kind of activity. And it's also just terrifying Jews around the world, because it's building up for all these anti-Semitic attacks that are happening and all this anti-Semitic sentiment that is happening. Blinken's probably going at this from both perspectives there. It's a question to me whether Bibi Netanyahu will listen to him. Do you think he will?
No, it's a very big question. First of all, my personal view is that Bibi will not survive in power once the fighting is finished. I don't know exactly by what means he will be toppled, but I don't think that over the next months and years that I think we're now facing in terms of the diplomatic and political processes that are required to put in place finally a just and lasting peace. I don't think that Bibi is going to be the chief interlocutor for all of the international parties who are concerned, including not least the U.S. But to your question directly, I don't think that Bibi will be very sympathetic to the message being sent by Blinken. And I think that his attitude in that regard is stiffened by the politics of his current situation, in which he's not a captive of, then certainly heavily dependent on a variety of very right-wing and settler-orientated political parties in Israel. The Smotrich serving as finance minister at the moment, Ben-Gvir in some national security or defense position, which is a little vaguely defined. These kinds of people have devoted lifetimes to not merely quelling or neutering Palestinian political power, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, but have very actively been pursuing what I personally regard as, and I think it's now widely recognized as, a process of purging what the international community calls the occupied territories and evicting as many Palestinians as possible and creating facts on the ground in the form of Israeli settlements, which will make the creation of a separate Palestinian state impossible and infeasible.
I think that's absolutely right. There's no ways that government can continue with their extremist policies, which, as you point out, are basically ethnic cleansing. There's very little,
Yeah.
very little else you can say about that. And
I think we've seen an upsurge of that activity. Blinken is, at the same time as he cautions about Israeli conduct in the south of Gaza, I think he's also had things to say about the way in which the Israeli state is operating in the West Bank. I think it's not unreasonable to suppose that it might be in the interests of the Smotriches and the Ben-Gurirs to push the Palestinians in the West Bank into such a tight corner and to wield the hammer so heavily that there'll be some pushback, there'll be some reaction, it'll be a kind of provocation. And that might then open the doors to even further Israeli action in the West Bank. But I don't think any of this is very mysterious at this point. I think it's quite clear that, first of all, I think they feel that they're in a limited window of time before international pressures are brought to bear, and they're dashing for daylight to accomplish as much as they can in terms of eviction of Palestinian families and whole villages, and the creation of new settlements to the extent they can.
Yeah.
So I think it's a shame, but it has brought into the daylight something which has in fact been going on for quite a while.
And I think the point is, the key point there was that Bibi cannot continue. And I think that's pretty much maybe it's accepted, maybe it isn't accepted. I certainly hope it's accepted by almost everybody. It looks like the polling numbers that he's performing under right now don't indicate much broad support anymore. And none of the partners want to dance with him anymore. And he certainly can't continue with that coalition government. So, it's interesting to hear you say that you don't see Bibi continuing. Now, Blinken arrived this evening and made a speech, which I thought was more profound than people have been saying. In fact, maybe because people haven't yet picked up on it. But it is, in my opinion, he's laid out a sort of a 5-point plan here towards a 2-state solution, which is another thing we've been hearing a lot of in the last few days. 2-state solutions from the Chinese. That's really what they said they were supporting. The UAE is now out in favor, saying 2-state solution is the only solution that exists. We're seeing a lot of, that's a term which, as you and I both know, has not been used very much recently in Israel, is now back in vogue. And here is Blinken's 5-point plan. He didn't call it that 5-point plan, but this is what it reads. Must improve the lives of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza in immediate, tangible ways. A lot of the onus there in Israel. Palestinians must have a credible path towards statehood. The wording there actually said, that Israel must provide the Palestinians with a credible path towards statehood. The U.S. has suggested practical steps, although it doesn't indicate what they are. They can to this end. And then number 4, which is quite a big ask here, is that a revitalized Palestinian authority, that's basically the West Bank Palestinian government, will govern both the West Bank and the Gaza. And number 5, that Ramallah, that same government, must reform itself, limit corruption or end corruption, and promote a free press. It has become far more democratic in form than they have been. And these might seem like they're to achieve at this, but on the other hand, this really is the only path. This is the path that can be taken right.
First of all, Blinken, these 5 points and Blinken's whole address this evening is really only an attempt to put meat on the bones of something which Biden himself has said in the last 48 hours, which is a clear and unequivocal positioning of the United States in favor of a 2-state solution. Now, as to Blinken's specific points, the one that gives me the most pause, not as to the good faith or spirit in which it's articulated, but as to its practicability, is number 4.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's true to say, and I've heard certainly a representative sample of resident Palestinians saying this, that the Palestinian Authority is widely viewed among Palestinians as having collaborated with Israel. And therefore, the legitimacy of as the focus of everyone's attention in trying to put in place the rudiments of a sustainable Palestinian government, whether the Palestinian Authority will command the respect and loyalty of the broad mass of Palestinians, is something about which I think at least there is a question mark. And it should not, I think Americans or others listening to this program should understand that the big quandary that we all face as we set out on the road to a two-state solution is how and around whom will Palestinians find a government and leaders who aren't tainted by the past, who aren't enormously corrupt in a variety of ways, and who have genuinely the public welfare at heart in terms of what they want to do with the power they're given.
Yeah, that is, of course, the biggest question. And what happens to Hamas? They've got to agree to this. They've got to walk away from this somehow and be made whole, however they would be made whole. I don't know. But they would view themselves as the legitimate government of Gaza and would certainly be as equally interested in running the Palestinian Authority if they could too. You have to convince them to walk away. And maybe that's been baked into this deal. I don't know. But that's probably that's a difficult conversation. Of course, the other difficult one is that some of the potential leaders in the new Palestinian Authority or the revitalized Palestinian Authority are in Israeli jails. They have to be released. That's also going to be a difficult thing for Israel. But it's
something which I expect to be floated, and I would regret it, is if in order to find leaders not tainted by the past, etc., there's the sort of search for impressive Western-oriented Palestinians sourced in Washington, D.C., London, etc., as we did in trying to construct a post-Saddam regime in Iraq.
Yeah, that's
clear. I think that's a knee-jerk reaction, is all the guys on the ground are dirty or incompetent or mistrusted by their people. So we need to parachute in some squad of guys who have been hanging out in think tanks in Washington, D.C. And that's unworkable, and it's just not legitimate.
It needs some of that, probably. It probably does need some brains to be able to think about the long-term development of these areas. It seems to me that you've got Gaza. This is perhaps a little callous to talk about it, but Gaza is probably some of the most prized beachfront property along the Mediterranean. You've got, I'm sure there are many developers in maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe those kinds of countries who are thinking, this is prime real estate. We can develop this into something pretty spectacular. Not to mention the oil around there. We can talk about that as well. But you've got potential there for what is going to need to be a large investment of rebuilding this area. But what are you going to rebuild it into? And if you are going to rebuild it, what are you going to be able to use to create these large economic ventures that really provide for the population of Gaza and Palestine and create jobs and create development, create ownership? That's really the dream, right? And ultimately it has got to come along with, you've got the right to vote. It's got to be, here's some ways to live.
Sure.
So it strikes me as that those are thinking, that kind of big thinking that maybe only comes from papers like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, maybe Dubai, those kinds of like broad, different ways of approaching things. Maybe that could be really interesting in this regard.
First of all, I'm not against importation of Palestinian talent.
Yeah.
The Palestinian diaspora is very large and very talented. If you move in financial and banking and accounting and legal circles throughout the Middle East, you are almost inevitably dealing at senior levels now with very talented Palestinians.
Yeah.
So there clearly is a brain bank to be tapped. I'm simply saying that the tapping of that talent has to somehow come organically from within the Palestinian people rather than being imposed sort of Sykes-Picot style from the 7th floor of the State Department.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very astute. That would be colonialism all over again. That's exactly what you want to avoid. So,
and we unfortunately, we have a recent history of having done that.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, but let's talk a little bit about the oil, because that is an opportunity for everybody. And as I look at I think it was the energy secretary who was like parachuted into Gaza last week of all times, like very recently, to just talk about the energy deals and talk about Gaza's incredible oil supply. I believe, I think there's some supplies there. You'll know better than me, but there's also this other pipeline that's being developed from Eilat to Ashkelon. I'm sure more about this than I do, but it seems to me like that's that pipeline, which is meant to distribute oil from Saudi Arabia and the UAE all the way through to Europe, basically, and even Russia and Turkey, that pipeline is going to need to run through potentially Gaza, potentially.
First of all, the particular pipeline you're talking about, which is jointly owned by the company itself, is called EAPC. The E is for Eilat and the A is for Ashkelon. These are the two terminus points. Ashkelon on the Mediterranean, Eilat in the Red Sea, and the PC is pipeline company. So E is now controlled by the Israeli government. The pipeline exists, and it was built jointly between the Israeli government and the Iranian government in the 1960s. And it was a means of Iran exporting its oil to Europe through Ashkelon. And even after the Shah fell, Israel surreptitiously and with a great deal of secrecy continued to allow Iranian oil to flow. And it was, among other things, one of the means used by, what was the guy's name? The founder of Glencore, Mark.
Mark Rose.
Anyway,
it'll come to me in a second. I don't say,
yeah,
but it's not that.
He was eventually indicted for sanction busting against the Iranian regime. And he was doing the sanction busting in part through that pipeline. Now, with the levying of sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, this has all come into a new focus because quite a number of ships which have exited the Bosphorus and transited the Eastern Mediterranean with cargoes of oil destined for Asia, particularly India, have discharged their cargoes at Ashkelon, and it has come out through the other end of the pipeline at Eilat.
Oh, really?
And it's interesting because it's a fairly hot issue. It's a live wire in Israel, not for political reasons, but for environmental reasons.
Oh, interesting.
There are environmentalist groups camped out in tents with long-range cameras, etc., trained constantly on the port at Eilat, and they are identifying through global data sites, etc., the ships which have all turned off their transponders and they're sailing under no flag. But these Israeli environmental groups are tracking their cargoes because there is a Israeli government limit on the volumes of oil that are allowed annually to pass through that pipe.
Okay.
And it is the belief of the environmental groups, and they're in the process of trying to demonstrate and document it, that the traffic that is going through that EAPC is handling far exceed that government limit. Now, another aspect of this is that there was an agreement signed in 2020, I think, between the UAE and Israel, which envisioned the use of that pipeline by the UAE to begin exporting some of its gas rather than oil in the UAE case.
Yeah, that's what at last I read about it. That's what I thought they were going to do, is use that from the oil.
Yeah, and because of everything that's now happened in Gaza, that's all been shoved to the side, and that was obviously part of the Abraham Accords. It was one of the things that the UAE was going to get out of the Abraham Accord deal, was the ability to use that infrastructure.
Maybe maybe that still exists in this world. We've got an actual potential agreement here. I don't know if how close they are. If all
now,
can be sorted out.
I think a more interesting issue around the question you pose is what role do energy resources play in this big drama in the region? People know that 10 or more years ago, a very large series of gas fields were discovered offshore Israel, which collectively go by the name Leviathan. And at more or less the same time, gas was discovered offshore Gaza. And there are agreements in place between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, with respect to the maritime boundaries or the jurisdiction of the Gazan waters, which encompass a very large proportion of the gas which Israel is desperate to tap. Israel was traditionally an energy importer. It has, by dint of these gas discoveries, turned itself around and is now a net exporter of gas, particularly to Egypt and Jordan. And these further fields, these finds, which the Israeli government has now given licenses for to 6 Western companies, including BP and Eni, the Italian state-owned national oil company. Those companies have drilled initial wells. It looks like there's over 1 trillion TCF of billion cubic feet of gas reserves, which have now been proven. And if they can be commercialized and brought to market, that would be a huge event in the Israeli economy. And some people say, I am personally not persuaded of this, but some people say that the Israeli thrust on Gaza, being as violent as it has been, is indeed about the eradication of a local population so as to allow Israel to take hold of these gas deposits, which are, in law and popular understanding, at least partially owned by the Palestinian Authority, and also Hamas is making claims to some of that. So it's a big mess. There's, as usual, one follows the money in these stories, but there is a significant issue around gas and to some extent oil. There, by the way, there's also significant gas in the West Bank.
Oh, interesting. You would have thought
Yes.
Israel has all these
I know.
resources. That kind of infusion into the economy in both Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, that sounds like a boon for everybody. This is probably enough to go around for a lot of people there and the lives of them.
I've seen estimates of what it might mean in terms of the budget of Hamas or the governing authority in Gaza, that it might mean as much as $500 million a year.
Wow.
If the projects were fully developed and commercialized.
Wow. And that's not including the pipeline. There's still a pipeline on top of that, right? Presumably it's additional money.
No.
There's potential here, and it's hard to strike a hopeful note here because there's still so much potential death coming here and so much more war coming. But they do through all these things. There really is an opportunity here, which seems like a once in a millennium kind of opportunity where you've got the economic backing of all these potential energy discoveries and the tapping of all these oil fields and gas fields and moving them around to various parts of the world, which can really support a growing and well-developed West Bank and Gaza and Israel. You could actually get to a point here where there is a path to peace and lots of prosperity for everybody.
Yeah, and as dynamic and fluid as the situation is in the Middle East, we've also got this ongoing drama in Ukraine, and that impacts this whole energy-related equation around Israel, Gaza, West Bank, etc., in as much as it has forced the EU to dramatically revise all of its energy supply chain thinking. And it's, as much as anything, the thirst of Europe for these incremental additional sources of gas supply that come out of Leviathan and offshore Gaza as anything else. It's not so much a function of the conflict that's going on now in the Middle East as it is people in Berlin and Paris, elsewhere, sitting around thinking, how are we going to keep our people warm this winter?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very big issue. I've got 2 other issues unrelated to Israel to talk to you about. Is there anything else you want to say about Israel? Because I don't want to talk about Elon Musk, and I also want to talk about...
Well, I do want to say, I do want to say one overarching thing, which is, I know you're keen to sound an optimistic note, and I share that. I'm certainly with you all the way. But for me, what is most optimistic, or if there is optimism, it relates to this. You know who Rahm Emanuel is?
I do know who Rahm Emanuel is, yes.
Currently the U.S. ambassador in Tokyo, previously mayor of Chicago, and a very close assistant to Barack Obama. Rahm Emanuel is supposed to have said, I don't know whether it's apocryphal, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Because in crises, things can be done which in normal times are virtually impossible. We may be at such a moment. And if we are, it's not because the Palestinian side of the equation, the Palestinian people, have come to some new understanding of their situation, except maybe as to their level of disgust with Hamas, which can be important. I think there is probably already going on, and there will continue to be real questions being asked on the Palestinian side about whether all this devastation has been worth it, and who are the guys who led us into this trap.
Yeah.
But on the Israeli side, I think there have been some very significant changes of mood and changes of mind, which may be the basis for optimism. And by that, I mean that I think we've now seen the implosion of an entire generation's thesis about how security could be achieved and what security meant. And we have lived through 20 years or so, most of it associated with Bibi Netanyahu, in which Israelis came to feel that the Iron Dome and heavily fortified settlements with houses with safe rooms, etc., that the Palestinian issue was under control.
Yeah.
And that if there were diplomatic objectives to be served, they were a la Abraham Accords and go talk in Riyadh, go talk in Amman, but we can forget about or shelf the Palestinian issue for the time being. I think that's been exploded.
Yeah.
And I think that's as much as anything, the reason why I said at the beginning, I doubt very much that Bibi will be the interlocutor for very much longer, because I think Israelis see that he sold them a policy and a vision of their security, which is no longer workable. And I think that a lot of Israelis now have come to understand something which, if you had polled them 10 years ago, it would not have been the same. But I think now you can expect to find a very large section of Israeli public opinion understanding that a solution has got to be found for the Palestinians.
Because it's absolutely, that's very correct. And I'm so glad you raised that, because in fact, what we've learned in the last few days is that there was advance warning for the Israelis. They knew exactly what was coming. Their junior officers had predicted and saw the signs in Gaza of exactly what happened days ahead. And some maybe it was a senior officer, decided not to go ahead with it. So there was, for whatever reason, didn't think it was important enough to pass up the chain and alert everybody.
So, two things. Even if they had believed those early reports, they were disabled in responding to them in any kind of a force because of the transfer of units from the southern border to the West Bank. Why is that? Because Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and the boys had been stirring up trouble, and it was expected that there might be a tempest in the West Bank. So the border posts were really denuded.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that. That's interesting detail. I talked to my father, who fought in 1973 in Yom Kippur. It reminded me of that day. It's like the story of that day. They were caught under they were so surprised by the events of Yom Kippur, or the start of the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
Sure.
Nothing was available to them. He had just finished his shift on doing some overnight reconnaissance, whatever it was he was doing. And he immediately was told by his superiors to go and get all this reservists to come to fight, because a serious event was happening.
Yeah.
And it sounded so much to me like what happened on October 7th, where they were like, oh, we're not ready. We're just not ready. And he was like, it's Yom Kippur. I can't go driving from the house to get these orders to your reservists. It's Yom Kippur. You don't do that. And they were like, you're doing it. That's how serious it is. And it's the similarities and the timing, of course, are very probably
also Yom Kippur.
Right.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
The improvisation that a lot of the young Israeli soldiers, men and women, showed is impressive. It's always been said about the American Army that one of our strengths is we have a lot of problems traditionally in the way we run our military, but one of the problems is that there's a great deal of initiative given at lower rank levels. So people faced with the kind of the need to act in an impromptu fashion, people do that.
Yeah.
And I've seen video of young Israeli women soldiers who jumped in tanks that they hadn't been trained to drive or shoot.
Yeah.
and they literally figured out how the guns worked as they rumbled down the highway.
Yeah. So it's just, you got to do that, right? You got to do what you got to do.
Exactly. Exactly. So,
I could keep talking about this stuff forever, but I do want to get your thoughts about Elon Musk because he ties into the story because he appears out of nowhere yesterday defending and apologizing, but also not apologizing for his really large scale gaslighting of people through his disinformation efforts and misinformation efforts around anti-Semitism. And he and Bibi have this unusual relationship because he had just returned from a visit with Bibi Netanyahu, and Bibi Netanyahu is taking him all around the kibbutzim that were attacked. And how do you explain that? This Israeli prime minister, who's very
by the way, it appears from photographs of Elon at the New York event yesterday that he's wearing IDF dog tags.
oh, that's interesting. I've got a clip here. I was going to play, but I'm wondering if we're going to run out of time for you, so I might insert it in the edit, but I'll look for those. That's interesting. He does seem to be. He's freshly off the plane. He just was touring the kibbutz with Bibi the day before. And how does an Israeli prime minister, in the midst of all of this, justify doing a PR tour for Elon Musk, who's whether he is or isn't really, I don't know, but he certainly seems to be the biggest supplier of anti-Semitic misinformation and disinformation in the world right now. How can you explain that, or can you explain that?
Putting aside what he's done to the platform, what I still call Twitter and he calls X, and that platform's hosting of the kind of media that you talk about, even in the event yesterday, he articulated a kind of conspiracy theory, anti-Semitic version of that these mass marches, which have been held in cities around the world, and particularly in the United States. He was focused, I think, in his remarks on the U.S., talked about New York and California, et cetera, were financed by prominent members of the Jewish community.
Yeah.
Which plays into all kinds of traditional shibboleths and conspiracy theories about the sort of shadowy power behind the scenes, the manipulative power of rich Jews, which is why you see the right continually going after George Soros, et cetera. All of this is very familiar to everybody. So I think it's clear not only that he is under the guise of free speech, he now claims to be a free speech absolutist, that under the guise of that, he's thrown open the doors to a bunch of filth on that platform that he owns, which is to be regretted. But I think when you hear him speak personally in the way that he did yesterday, it begins to be clear to me, at least, that he's got a very serious anti-Semitic turn of mind, and that he's easily persuaded by anybody who's sounding the alarm about Jews. Personally, I think he's very disturbed mentally.
It does not well, for sure. That was not a healthy performance by any CEO of any company.
No,
certainly not one that's responsible for public discourse. And to your point, I think what he's saying in his clip that I was going to play with is he's saying, I'm going to let Twitter die at the hands of Disney or all these media executives, all these media companies that are going to refuse to advertise on my brand. That's just setting up this whole idea of Twitter is going to be killed by a bunch of, he doesn't say it, but understand where he's going. Big, rich media people in the world is going to be angry at those rich media people for doing what they did to Twitter. That's what his mindset is. It doesn't seem he's got some issues to deal with there on that, because
it butts right up against what is for me the key question, which is, for all the reasons you've just said, that was a performance, that was a set of statements that no CEO concerned about the health, the financial health and the business vitality of an enterprise that he controlled, nobody would say those things, right? So that leads to the question, which is very often asked, I see it daily on Twitter in one way or another. What exactly is Elon's mission here? Is he actually pursuing a very wrong-headed but sincerely held view as to how to grow and sustain Twitter? Or does he have an ulterior motive, which is to shutter the company, damage it beyond recognition, drive people like me and others of more liberal persuasion away, rendering it ineffective as a communications platform as we head into the 2024 election?
Inco. I'd go with I'll go with that option because that's exactly what he's doing. At the end of the day, you and I were both there in the trenches in 2016, and we've seen what's happened to that platform. It's changed a lot, and
Terrible.
And shuttering that place takes away one of the biggest weapons American people had in fighting for democracy.
Yeah,
it is terrible. It is terrible, and maybe he'll.
And if that's his agenda, one wonders who's acting in concert with him on that agenda. A lot of his funding is international. Saudis are said to be very prominent in the list of equity investors. And one has to look at them and consider whether the torpedoing of Twitter might also serve their interests. And as far as I can see, there's good reason to think that it might.
Wow, good thoughts, interesting thoughts. They're not necessarily good thoughts, but you're right. I think also China might have the same sort of ideas around that as might the other backers in the not only the Middle East, but I think there is some Oracle backing there and some other backing that goes on. That's Bibi Netanyahu's sort of territory, which maybe explains why Elon and Bibi hung out at the kibbutz. I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we have to, because I got to get it ready here for the show. But Henry Kissinger, you must have some thoughts here. Not an easy one.
I posted about it yesterday on Twitter. There's a long thread which has gotten a fair amount of notice. And I actually posted it first in May of 23, at which time I guess he was being feted in some way, but he hadn't yet died. And I reposted it on the occasion of his death. First of all, with my father in the State Department and at various times in close proximity to Kissinger before he rose to prominence, I've had him on my radar screen since the mid-'60s, since I was an adolescent, and have thought that he was historically, epically criminal, anti-constitutional, and the conventional term from Chris Hitchens on down is war criminal. I think one can attach to his name millions of deaths through indiscriminate bombings. The kind of bombing that we're all screaming about in Gaza is dwarfed by what went on over Cambodia. And the list is long, so I won't rehearse that now. But I will say one thing about Henry, which I don't think gets enough attention, and that is that he operated within the U.S. political context and system in a deeply anti-constitutional and illegal way on numerous occasions. And I charge him with having been one of the chief architects of what has been called by Arthur Schlesinger and others the imperial presidency and the dismantling of checks and balances around executive power, which have not been helpful in general in this country. He was so concerned over leaks over their Vietnam policy and what was transpiring, this is in the Nixon era, that he conspired with J. Edgar Hoover directly and personally to run illegal, unwarranted wiretaps on 17 of his own National Security Council staff and journalists. And then when he was nominated to be Secretary of State and was questioned about that in the Senate confirmation hearings, lied brazenly about it, which official records, which have now been opened for that period, now make crystal clear. He was simply a brazen liar about having engaged in criminal activity. There are any number of instances like that, which to me say, however brilliant he may or may not have been, he is someone who never internalized, really understood or agreed with the rules of the game in the American political system as laid out in the Constitution. He was always about end running the system and circumventing the system. And I think to some extent what we saw with Trump and impeachment 1.0 and the extorting of Zelensky, dirt for arms, all of that is very much in the spirit of Henry Kissinger.
Absolutely. His realpolitik was very much also stunty, and October surprise, probably more associated with him than anybody else. You think before Rudy took the October surprise architect hat, Henry Kissinger did it.
The other, just one more anecdote about Henry, which is, I think, very telling about his sort of just personal treachery and disloyalty, is that when he was still at Harvard and the Johnson administration with Dean Rusk as Secretary of State had initiated contacts with Ho Chi Minh, which resulted in a set of very secret discussions going on in a villa outside of Paris. Henry importuned Rust and the people who were involved in those talks, saying that he could be an advisor to them. And for one reason or another, they allowed him into the circle. And he was going back and forth to Paris, contributing to the discussions with Ho Chi Minh. All the while reporting to Nixon, who was then squaring up to run for president.
Wow.
And Nixon promised him to be the national security advisor if the election worked out in Nixon's favor, which it did. And from that, he became Secretary of State. It was a direct, and all the guys on the State Department side of that, in that early Paris effort, felt personally betrayed. He was lying to them all the way through, telling them how much he hated Nixon, what a disaster Nixon would be for the country. And he was reporting directly to Nixon.
That does say a lot about him, doesn't it? Rick, thanks so much for being here tonight. It's always fascinating.
Thanks for having me. Always nice to talk with you.
Yeah, it's just terrific to having these conversations and great insights on all of these topics. I'll be looking forward to be playing out it later tonight, and you'll be able to find the podcast tomorrow. But I want to thank you very much for being here tonight. That's Rick Petree.
I thank you.
Yeah. Every minute of Narratives reporting, every story that we break is made possible by our patrons. You too can become a patron by joining at patreon.com/narrative.
Narrative, where truth lives. One day, you'll tell the story of autocrats, crooks, and kings who came for our freedom. A story of citizens who stood up to tyranny and won. The people prevailed and renewed an old vow to a more perfect union. And that was just the beginning. The story continues. Narrative, where truth lives.